The Fire Upstairs is a new podcast miniseries about the upstairs lounge arson that happened in 1973 in a gay bar in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Joining me now is its creators, Joey Gray and Ryan Krause. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen.
So happy to be here.
Have you?
Yeah, thank you for having us.
I thoroughly enjoyed the podcast, so this is a joy for me to chat with you today. Can you tell us more about the inspiration behind creating the Fire Upstairs podcast and why you chose to focus on the 1973 upstairs lounge arson?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the most obvious being that the 50th anniversary just passed. On June 24th of this year was 50 years since the arson happened. So it seemed, I think it was back maybe January, Ryan and I had really come together and decided that we were going to make this happen. And we had this date in mind of when we wanted to have something in the world to sort of like transmit this history and knowledge. So just that alone was enough inspiration for us. And, you know, beyond that, it's what we cover in the podcast. And I hope what people find in listening to it is that so many of the themes and the social and cultural circumstances surrounding what was going on in 1973 in New Orleans and affecting the lives of those in the arson is so similar to what we're dealing with today. So we're trying to sort of connect those dots historically and show people that not only is it important to learn and know our history, but learning and knowing our history is directly related to the things that we're experiencing in contemporary settings.
The inspiration from this, which one of you saw the book? I was listening to that, Joey.
Yeah, so that would have been me telling the story. I actually came across it in, I think it was 2015, but the book was initially published by Johnny Townsend in 2011. He had spent decades, truly, tracking down and researching and interviewing folks that were directly involved with the arson and the events that happened, from survivors to community members. And he couldn't get anyone to publish it. So he ended up self-publishing. And I came across the book sort of by happenstance, visiting a friend in New Orleans. It was on my first trip. I tell the story briefly in the first episode. And it was just so jarring. I mean, the cover art alone, the title, Let the Faggots Burn. He's since republished it with a less punchy title. But it really stuck with me. It left such an impression. And for years, I kind of sat with the story and I would kind of come back to it and, you know, it would drift in and out of mind. And, like I said previously, coming up on this 50th anniversary really felt like an important time to sort of do something.
And it's a very sensitive subject. Ryan, were there any challenges researching and producing episodes about such a tragic event from the past? How did you approach handling, you know, sensitive topics and emotions that obviously go along with it?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that Joey and I came across early on in the process of is wanting to speak with people who have firsthand experience, who were either inside the bar or had loved ones who were inside the bar. And I mean, as you can imagine, after 50 years of being interviewed and telling these stories, it's a lot for some people. The bartender, the man who was the bartender the night that the fire broke out, Buddy Rasmussen, actually doesn't do interviews anymore. So it really, and as you can imagine, you know, 50 years have gone by. So people have either passed away or moved on, or, you know, kind of life has kind of come in. So, you know, getting those firsthand accounts was, I think, definitely something that Joey and I knew that we needed to do, but was also probably, I think, the biggest hurdle for us is including those voices. But we were able to speak with Ricky Everett, someone who was inside the bar that night, and he gave us some really touching firsthand account of his experience, which I think is kind of invaluable to helping listeners understand what it was like that night and the impact that it had on these people.
Was the bar respecting the local community? Because you mentioned that it had a dance floor or a dance license, which was unheard of. Most bars were being closed down and raided at this time. How did they get that? They must have been respected or within the community. How did that happen?
Yeah, I think, you know, it was a big effort by the owner of the bar, Phil, and Buddy in tandem to kind of keep it as a space that would be free of those kind of raids, and in turn would then provide a safer space for the community. So they had a really good relationship with the local community, with the local law enforcement. And I think, you know, it's kind of crazy to think of a gay bar at that time never having been raided. I mean, the bar was only open for about 3 years, but, you know, when you think about the frequency of raids of gay bars in that time, Stonewall, etc. It's quite a feat to stay quote unquote above board. I think a lot of that has to do with Buddy had some rules that he had in effect for the bar. I think when people would associate gay bars with places of ill repute and drug dealing and prostitution and things like that. And, they had really strict rules about no drug use or drug dealing. If you were a hustler, you were welcome in the bar, but you weren't to be there picking up, your John for the night. And there was no secretive illicit affairs to happen in the bathroom. And I think it's a quote that's used by a few different people, but they kind of call it the cheers of gay bars. And it was kind of that like familial living room environment versus the kind of stereotypical, I think, kind of negative connotation that some other bars at the time would have.
How do you believe understanding and reflecting on the significant event of the Upstairs Lounge arson can shape and help queer folk today and this generation, especially with everything going on right now?
Yeah, I think, Joey and I have talked about this a lot, and it is one of those things where, it feels a lot like time is a flat circle. And we've touched on this before, where like a lot of the things that the queer community today is facing are things that our elders have faced before: the rhetoric, the anti-LGBTQ legislation. And so as Joey mentioned previously, by understanding our history and by understanding the way in which we overcame these obstacles previously, it empowers us to use those tools and rely on our community to do so again. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like we're staring down the barrel of a fairly dark period of our country and our future. And while I do think there's a lot to worry about, I think there's hope that can be found in stories like this. And that hope comes from the resilience of our community and kind of the way in which we band together and we overcome. So I think that's the biggest thing for me in this.
I would add that I think there's also a lesson. I mentioned it in the tail end of the first episode. I think that a large misconception about the events of the fire was that it was a hate crime, or that it was an attack from outside of our community. And I think what's really important to hold on to and remember is that this was somebody who, for all intents and purposes, was a community member. This was a young gay man who set the fire. So what I have sort of tried to be very mindful of in all of my handling of these events and of the history and of the storytelling of it is a sense of brotherhood and a sense of kindness that I hope that we can foster by telling these kinds of stories. Because to the outside world, LGBTQIA is this sort of umbrella term for every one of our individual experiences. But when we think about what happened at the Upstairs Lounge and we think about within that umbrella, there is so much difference and so much diversity to celebrate, but also something that we need to maintain a mindfulness and a care for when we think about how we treat one another, how we show up for one another, how we support each other. So I think in telling this story now, we can hopefully remind folks just how important that still is.
Where can people listen to this podcast? Let's get it out there. I want everyone to hear it.
Well, first of all, you can listen to it on any platform that you get your podcasts. So I think Spotify and Apple are the two obvious. I believe there's a Google option. So start there, and I'm sure you'll find your way to it. And I do think just, the more often we tell our stories, the better. It's in today's episode that's released, Ben de la Creme says that our history is campfire storytelling. So we've got to just keep telling each other these stories. It starts with one person telling a friend. And we realize the more we do that we are actually all part of this fabric, this larger quilt of a culture, because it's not passed down directly the way that bloodline lineage is, or that our collected histories are, the way in, biological families. We have this sort of shared sense of community and history as queer people, that the more we tell our stories, the more we familiarize ourselves with our history, we feel more a part of something. And I hope that's a way that we honor the victims and the survivors of the Upstairs Lounge. And I hope that it's a way that we can honor our community broadly by doing this work and continuing to tell these stories.
And thanks so much for watching Advocate today. Download the app in the Apple or Google Play Store to stream us live, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Advocate channel, I'm Aaron Dean.